Hi guys, tonight we journey not to palaces or battlefields, but into the forgotten gut of history, into the belly of war itself. Imagine this, you're knee-deep in mud, your uniform soaked from days of rain, rats nibble at your boots, and the distant thunder isn't a storm but artillery. Now ask yourself, what's for dinner? In the trenches of World War I, where death came from above, below, and within, soldiers found themselves fighting not only the enemy but hunger, rot, and meals that could make even the bravest men weep. This isn't just a story about war. It's about tin cans filled with despair, tea with a hint of mud, and bread that cracked teeth before it touched the soul. This is about what sustained an army when the world was falling apart. So if you've ever wondered how men survived weeks without real food, what trench tea tasted like, or why the appearance of a dead horse was considered a miracle, stay with me. Like and subscribe to my channel if you want more journeys into hidden corners of history. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights, leave the world. Let's begin the story. You are a young British soldier, just 19, and you've arrived at the Western Front. The mud smells like something ancient. The barbed wire stretches like the ribs of a great dying beast, and already your stomach growls. You reach into your kit bag not for a weapon, but for a ration tin. It's square, cold, heavy, with mystery. Your sergeant told you what to expect, but still, you hoped for something more. Maybe stew, maybe biscuits, maybe something resembling food. You open it, inside, a pale lump. It's called maconochie. Maconochie stew, a name that sent shivers. Invented for the British Army, this infamous tinned stew consisted of diced turnips, carrots, and fatty meat floating in a watery broth that turned to jelly in the cold and to sludge in the heat. It looked like leftovers from someone else's nightmare. It smelled like the inside of your boot, and yet you ate it because you had to. Soldiers joked that maconochie could kill a rat at 10 paces or worse, make one return it to the cook. But maconochie was just the beginning. Let's talk about trench bread. It wasn't soft, it wasn't warm, and it didn't crumble, it cracked, called hardtack or army biscuits. This was more weapon than nourishment. If you dropped it, it might not break. If you bit into it, you might. Men soaked them in water, tea, or even rum, just to make them chewable. Some even grated them into powder and stirred them into soup, or what passed for soup in the trenches. Breakfast in the trenches, a distant dream. Most days began with trench tea made from leaves, so reused they were more memory than flavor. The tea was boiled in whatever water could be found. Sometimes the water came from shell craters, sometimes from puddles, sometimes it was brown before the leaves even touched it. One soldier described it as tasting of earth and fire, with a finish of rat. Yet soldiers clung to it. It was warmth, it was habit, and above all, it was British. Lunch, it depended on the shelling. If the artillery wasn't too heavy, rations were brought up. If not, men ate whatever they had left. That might mean bully beef, canned corned beef, so fatty it shimmered like metal under the sun. You'd scoop it out with a knife, smear it on trench bread, and chew until it felt like food. Or it might mean ration chocolate, though it was rarely sweet. Designed for energy, not joy, it was hard, bitter, and dense enough to bruise a tooth. Sometimes, food was less about nutrition and more about morale. Enter rum rations. Every day, British soldiers were given a small tot of rum, not to enjoy, but to endure. It warmed the body, dulled the nerves, and quieted the nightmares. Many claimed it was the only thing that made trench life bearable. French soldiers received red wine, Germans often had beer or schnapps, and the Americans, they were late to the party, but brought their own flavor, black coffee and canned bacon. Let's talk about meat, or the lack of it. Most meat came in tins. If it didn't, it was suspect. Fresh meat was rare. If an animal died near the lines, soldiers might risk life and limb to salvage it. Horses, pigs, even dogs. One tale tells of a French unit who roasted a mule over a fire, seasoning it with trench salt ashes, mud, and a bit of hope. Another account tells of soldiers frying rats, yes, rats, skinned, cooked, and eaten over fire. Some swore it tasted like chicken. Others swore never to tell. Food became folklore. When rumors spread of a real egg, a tomato, or, heaven forbid, a fried potato, the trench would buzz like Christmas had come early. Men swapped rations like currency, chocolate for tobacco, tea for sugar, a biscuit for a bite of someone's preserved peach tin, and woe to the man who hoarded. He might find his boots filled with jam the next morning or worse. Cooking, that was improvisation. Trench kitchens were makeshift, a fire in a biscuit tin, a pan borrowed from a mess tent, water from who knows where. Men became survival chefs. They mashed together anything edible into slop, bully, beef, biscuit, and a few dried peas. They gave their creations names, like slum, burgoo, or trench pie. No one knew what was in it, but they ate it anyway. What about vegetables, fresh fruit, vitamins? Almost none. That's why trench foot and scurvy were rampant. Soldiers' gums bled, their teeth loosened, and they limped not from wounds, but from malnutrition. When oranges or onions did arrive, they were guarded like gold, and sometimes they were stolen. There's a famous case of an onion causing a fight between two regiments. The onion didn't survive, neither did the peace. What did soldiers dream of? Not medals, not glory, but roast dinners. They wrote letters home begging for cake, for jam, for sausages wrapped in paper. Families sent food parcels. Sometimes they arrived, sometimes they were stolen, sometimes they exploded. Yes, the Germans once intercepted a British food crate and booby-trapped it with dynamite. The next soldier, who opened a box of cookies, didn't make it to dessert. Not all food was bad, just most of it. On rare days, Christmas, armistice, or a brief truce troops were treated to real meals: roast beef, apple pie, real bread, warm from field ovens. The kind of meal that made a man remember he had a mother, a home, a life beyond the trench. Those days were rare, but remembered forever. But the worst enemy wasn't just hunger, it was monotony. Imagine eating the same thing for 300 days straight. Same stew, same biscuit, same tea. No flavor, no spice, no joy. That's what many soldiers faced. Food was survival, not taste. One diary entry reads, "I would kill for an egg. I would marry for a pie. I would die for a cucumber sandwich." As the war dragged on, even the rations suffered. Tin supplies ran low. Salt became scarce. Spoiled shipments were sent anyway. Soldiers found maggots in meat tins. Some shrugged, picked them out, ate the rest. Rats grew fat in the trenches, feeding on soldiers' crumbs. Sometimes they grew the size of cats. Some units held rat hunting contests. Winner got the biggest rat, and maybe a clean biscuit. So what was the final verdict on trench food? It was grim, it was gray, it was barely food. but it kept men alive, barely, and that, in the end, was its job. The year is 1519, and the sails of ships rise like ghosts off the coast of Mexico. The winds carry not just the scent of salt water and sun-baked wood, but also ambition restless, razor-sharp, and heavy with the scent of gunpowder and gold. A man born in the rugged hills of Spain steps ashore with a mind ablaze with conquest and a heart that beats to the rhythm of empire. Behind him, a small army, less than 600 men. Before him, an empire of millions. Yet Cortés is no ordinary man. Beneath his polished armor and narrow eyes is a vision soaked in blood and glory. He has disobeyed orders. He has burned his ships. He has cast his diamond. There is no turning back. The land he enters is rich with color, noise, and complexity. The Mexica the people, the Spanish, would call Aztecs, dominate the region through the power of fear and tribute. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, floats like a dream upon a lake, with causeways and temples that make even the hardened soldiers gasp in awe. But this is not admiration. This is measurement, is studying a prize. It begins with alliances. He marches eastward and meets the Totonacs, a people chafing under Aztec tribute demands. They see in a strange weapon, white-skinned, bearded, armored, and armed with thunder. They whisper of an ancient prophecy, a pale god returning from the east. Lets them believe it. He needs no miracles, only misunderstanding. He then climbs the highlands and meets the Tlaxcalan's fierce warriors, who first battle him, then join him. They, too, hate the Aztecs. And, ever the manipulator, promises freedom. He speaks of kingship, of Spain, of the crossbutt. What he truly offers is vengeance. Further into the valley of Mexico, makes a gift of steel and spectacle. Horses that snort like demons, cannons that roar like thunder gods, armor that arrows cannot pierce, to the peoples of Mesoamerica. These things are not merely foreign, they are unearthly. He arrives at Cholula, the holy city of many pyramids. The priests there smile with painted lips, but behind the walls hears whispers of treachery. Whether these threats are real or invented, acts without hesitation. His men fall upon the city in a storm of blade and flame. Thousands are slaughtered in hours. The message is clear. Resistance is death. As Cortés nears Tenochtitlan, the Emperor Moctezuma grows restless. His priests speak of omens, comets, floods, strange animals. He sends gifts of gold to the Spaniards. But gold, too, is not a gift. It is a summons. It only whets his hunger. On November 8, 1519, enters Tenochtitlan. The Spaniards cross the causeways and behold a city unlike any they have imagined. Tenochtitlan shines with clean streets, aqueducts, floating gardens. Temples pierce the sky. The marketplace hums with color and order. Moctezuma welcomes. He treats him as an honored guest, perhaps even as a divine one. The emperor wears turquoise, gold, and feathers like flame. He speaks through interpreters, first through Marina. The enslaved woman has taken as consort and translator, and then through others. Marina, or La Malinche, understands more than language. She sees power shift between worlds, is respectful, but not fooled. He observes the city's defenses, the soldiers, the towers, and then, like a snake coiled in silk, he strikes. Moctezuma is taken hostage within his own palace. The emperor becomes a puppet, forced to speak Spanish demands with a trembling voice, while Cortés consolidates power. Trouble brews. A rival Spanish force under D arrives on the coast, sent to arrest for disobedience. Marches out with a smaller force, defeats and wins over his men. With reinforcements, he returns to Tenochtitlan only to find it in chaos. In his absence, the Spaniards under Alvarado had committed a massacre during a religious festival. The city has risen in fury. Streets once open are now battlefields. Moctezuma, dragged to the rooftop to calm his people, is struck perhaps by stone, perhaps by despair. He dies shortly after, and the fragile illusion of peace shatters. The Spanish flee the city in the dead of night. It is called La Noche Triste, Night of Sorrows. As they retreat along the causeways, Aztec warriors strike from the water, from rooftops, from canoes. Hundreds of Spaniards and their native allies die. Gold sinks into the lake with the bodies, survives. Bloodied, exhausted, but unbroken. He regroups in Tlaxcala, rebuilds, reforges, alliances. More ships are built from the wreckage. More allies rally to his banner not because they love him, but because they hate the Aztecs more. The siege of Tenochtitlan begins. It is a slow strangling. The Spaniards cut off supplies. They blockade the lake with brigantines, warships built inland, carried plank by plank to the water. Hunger creeps into the city. Disease follows. Smallpox, brought by a single infected Spaniard, ravages the population. Tens of thousands die. And yet the Aztecs fight, with fury, with fire, with everything they have left. But steel crushes obsidian, gunpowder silences the drums, and desperation feeds ambition. On August 13th, 1521, the city falls. Tenochtitlan burns. Its temples are toppled, its canals filled with rubble, its survivors enslaved, tortured, or scattered. The empire is no more. Walks the shattered causeways, not as a guest but as a conqueror. He names the ruins Mexico City. He sends back gold and letters to Spain. The king rewards him with titles, Governor of New Spain, Captain General. But with every treasure ship that sails, suspicion grows. Rivals and enemies circle. Lawsuits, rumors, and politics dog his every step. His power begins to wane. Journeys to Honduras. He searches for other kingdoms to conquer. He returns to Spain, pleads before the king, fights for his rights. But time has moved on. He is no longer the hero of letters. He is the villain of debate. In the end, he dies in relative obscurity in 1547. Not poor, not forgotten, but not quite honored either. For what court earths unleashed in the New World cannot be contained in titles. He brought down an empire, yes, but at a cost, written in blood, fire, and memory. He left behind a changed world, a world where Spain would rule for centuries, where native cultures would be buried and blended, where gods would be replaced, languages rewritten, and gold turned to crosses. He was a man of his time, but even his time could barely contain him. And though his name is carved into the stone of conquest, it is also etched in the bones of the fallen, whispered in the ruins of temples, and remembered not only as a conqueror, but as the spark that set a world ablaze. The bronze blade glinted under the midday sun, crude yet deliberate. In a small open-air hut near the banks of the Nile, a man lay still on a woven mat, his eyes fluttering behind closed lids. The healer stood over him, one hand steadying a sharpened obsidian scalpel, the other gripping a linen cloth soaked in fermented beer and crushed poppy risona, primitive anesthetic. It was 2500 BCE in ancient Egypt, and the man was about to have a cyst removed from his shoulder. This was not a place of guesswork. Egyptian medicine, though wrapped in ritual and divine invocation, had foundations in observation and long tradition. Surgeons known as SNU were highly trained practitioners. They read from scrolls like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 15-foot document filled with detailed case studies, instructions, and prognoses. These weren't tales of magic. They were logical, empirical notes on fractures, wounds, abscesses, and even spinal trauma. And surgery, though dangerous, was not feared. It was practiced regularly. Egyptians performed trepanation, removing part of the skull to relieve pressure. They drained abscesses using reeds and copper tools. They sutured wounds with linen, thread, and honey, both known for antimicrobial properties. They used raw meat and moldy bread, not as superstition, but for their cooling and antiseptic effects. Even their embalming rituals, strange as they seem today, honed techniques for precision cutting, organ extraction, and preservation skills, not wasted in the world of the living. Yet Egypt was not alone. Further east, in Mesopotamia, surgeons worked beneath ziggurats and temple courtyards. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1754 BCE, lists not only laws but surgical fees and consequences. If a surgeon operated on a nobleman's eye and saved it, he earned 10 shekels. If he failed and the patient died, his hands were cut off. Surgery here was serious business. Mesopotamian healers worked with bronze knives, reeds, sharpened stones. They drained infected wounds, amputated crushed limbs, removed embedded arrows. They even practiced early forms of cataract surgery, though rudimentary and often unsuccessful. Pain was endured or dulled with beer, opium, or ritual chants to the gods of healing Nint, Nuga, Gula, and Damu. To them, illness was part spiritual, part physical. Demons were blamed for tumors, for fevers, for wounds that would not close, but knives were still used. Blood was still let, flesh was still stitched, and then westward to the Hellenic world. In Greece, by the 5th century BCE, the practice of surgery took a new form: rational, observational, experimental. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, laid foundations for surgical ethics, diagnosis, and methods. His followers described shoulder dislocations, compound fractures, and treatments for head wounds with chilling detail. Their tools evolved: iron scalpels, bone elevators, cautery irons. Cauterization became the answer to many ailments. Close the wound with fire, stop the bleeding, clean the flesh. Greek physicians drained fluid from pleurocystric lungs. They performed mastectomies for breast cancer. They lanced hemorrhoids with surgical knives. And though pain relief was limited, they used mandrake root, opium, and hemlock in cautious doses to dull the senses. The Greek battlefield served as both hospital and laboratory. Surgeons learned through war how to amputate quickly, how to extract javelins, how to prevent rot. Experience was brutal, but it was experience nonetheless. As the Greek world gave way to Rome, surgery expanded with military precision. Roman field medics, medicued, marched with every legion. Behind the spears and shields, carts carried chests of surgical instruments: forceps, hooks, probes, scalpels, bone saws. These were not symbolic tools. They were used often, and with chilling efficiency. Roman surgeons set bones with splints. They drained infected joints with long bronze needles. They removed bladder stones by cutting into the perineum. The operation was called lithotomy, and though excruciating, it was sometimes life-saving. Galen, the famed Greek physician working in Rome, wrote vast texts on anatomy and surgery, though his work was based heavily on animal dissection: pigs, monkeys, dogs. His understanding of nerves, muscles, and arteries shaped surgical knowledge for centuries. Yet not all Roman surgery was battlefield necessity. In cities like Alexandria and Pergamon, elite patients underwent cosmetic and reconstructive procedures. They had warts cut away, eyelids reshaped, teeth extracted, even hemorrhoids burned off with hot irons. And yes, castration too was a practiced art, though often performed on slaves. In India, the ancient science of Surdrashalya Tantra flourished. As early as 600 BCE, the Sushruta Samhita, a Sanskrit medical text attributed to the surgeon Sushruta, described hundreds of surgical procedures and tools. Sushruta spoke of precise incisions, sterilization techniques, and careful postoperative care. He detailed methods for treating hernias, bladder stones, cataracts, and bone fractures. But perhaps his most astonishing contribution was rhinoplasty reconstruction of the nose. In India, the punishment for adultery or theft often involved nose amputation. Sushruta devised a technique to rebuild the nose using a flap of skin from the cheek or forehead, creating a living graft. The method, now called the Indian flap, is still referenced in modern plastic surgery. Sushruta also emphasized patient care. He urged surgeons to keep their instruments clean, to observe hygiene, to treat the poor as equally as the rich. He saw surgery not as violence, but as compassion with a blade. Elsewhere in China, by the time of the Han Dynasty, surgery was practiced with a mix of philosophy and precision. Hua, too, a famous surgeon from the 2nd century CE, used herbal anesthetics to dull upon a potion called mafizin, a mix of wine and powdered cannabis. With it, he performed abdominal surgeries, removed infected intestines, and even treated wounds deep in the torso. Huatu's techniques were lost after his death, his writings destroyed by jealous rulers. But legends say he once removed a spear tip from a warlord's shoulder with such delicacy that the patient laughed through the procedure. In the Americas, among the Inca and pre-Columbian cultures, trepanation was not rare, it was widespread. Skulls with healed cranial holes have been found across Peru and Bolivia, dating back over 1,000 years. These were not fatal injuries. They were performed with flint tools, sometimes for head trauma, sometimes to release spirits. Astonishingly, survival rates were high. Some studies suggest over 60%. Incas used coca leaves to dull pain, chicha beer to clean wounds, and obsidian blades to cut with surgical accuracy. They knew the skull's sutures, respected the brain's vulnerability. Even among the Maya, surgeons worked with obsidian knives, jade tools, and stingray spines. They stitched wounds with thorns and human hair. They drained abscesses, cauterized gashes, and cleaned wounds with honey and tobacco. Ritual and medicine blurred, but skill remained. Africa, too, had ancient surgical traditions. In sub-Saharan communities, bone setting, abscess, lancing, and even caesarean sections were practiced before colonial contact. Among the Bonero people of Uganda, caesareans were performed with astonishing cleanliness, iron blades sterilized by fire, banana wine used as antiseptic and anesthetic, and wounds closed with iron hooks or thorns. European missionaries recorded these operations in the 19th century, shocked by the success rates. Surgery was not the property of the West, nor the East alone. It was human, born from necessity, sharpened by observation, refined by pain, and yet it was never safe. A cut could heal or kill. An incision might release infection or invite it. Without modern anesthesia, antiseptics, or antibiotics, every surgery was a wager. But those who practiced it, across time and civilization, carried a strange bravery. They cut not to harm, but to heal, and in doing so, they carved the first fragile lines of medicine's most dangerous art. The knife pressed deeper, slow and steady, guided not by haste but by memory. In a quiet courtyard of a temple in Thebes, under the watching eye of a falcon god carved in stone, a healer stitched closed a soldier's thigh wound with linen thread dipped in honey and myrrh. The thread passed cleanly through the tissue, and as each loop tightened, so too did the thread between life and death. But time would not stand still. As the classical age faded, the world entered a new chapter, one shaped by religion, isolation, and strange dualities. In the early centuries of the Common Era, as Rome fragmented and fell, much of Europe's surgical knowledge flickered and dimmed. The empire's collapse meant the loss of organized hospitals, professional training, and open anatomical study. Where once medical texts were copied in marble-floored libraries, they now gathered dust in crumbling monasteries. Surgery became the domain of two classes, the learned physician and the working barber. Physicians, often trained in the remnants of Galenic doctrine, considered surgery beneath them. Cutting flesh was manual labor, a craft for the lowborn. Real medicine, they believed, came through humors and herbs, not blades. Barbers, however, filled the void. They became the barber's surgeon's men who shaved beards, pulled teeth, and lanced boils. They practiced bloodletting and trepanation. They traveled with armies, sometimes learning more on the battlefield than in books. In medieval Europe, surgery survived but just barely. Consider the case of Guy de Chauliac, a 14th-century French physician who revived surgical study through his work Chirurgia Magna. Written during the time of the Black Death, his text drew from Arabic sources, classical Greek, and personal observation. He stressed cleanliness, careful diagnosis, and avoidance of unnecessary procedures. But even he cautioned them or operate unless absolutely necessary. Infection, blood loss, and pain were the surgeon's eternal enemies. While Europe faltered, the Islamic world advanced. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, Islamic scholars preserved, translated, and expanded upon Greek and Roman medical texts. In the great hospitals of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, surgery was practiced with refinement. Al-Zarawi, known in the West as Al-Bukisis, was the towering figure of surgical innovation. His 10th-century text Al-Zarif spanned 30 volumes and detailed over 200 surgical tools. He described procedures for fractures, tumors, childbirth complications, and even the removal of bladder stones. Al-Zarawi's illustrations of forceps, scalpels, speculums, and catheters were revolutionary. His methods emphasized technique, hygiene, and aftercare. He warned against overconfidence and emphasized humility, a rare voice in an age of dogma. In the Islamic world, surgery was not shameful. It was science. Across the Mediterranean, in the Jewish communities of the Middle Ages, surgery found further refuge. Jewish physicians, often multilingual and mobile, absorbed knowledge from Greek, Arab, and Latin texts. They served in royal courts and were sought for their skills in treating wounds, resetting bones, and performing circumcisions. And while religion often cast shadows on the practice of surgery, these communities navigated faith and medicine with balance, preserving human life as the highest law. In the East, surgery in medieval China evolved with measured caution, while acupuncture and herbalism dominated Chinese medicine. Surgical procedures, though fewer, were still practiced. The Tang dynasty physician Sun Sima, sometimes called the King of Medicine, wrote on ethical surgery, emphasizing that the surgeon must possess not only skill but compassion. His texts recommended minor surgeries, abscess, drainage, wart removal, and dislocations. Chinese surgeons used instruments of bronze and jade. Pain was dulled with herbal sedatives, acupuncture, and heated cups. Surgery was not seen as ideal but, as a last resort, it was permitted. The ancient fear remained that cutting into the body was cutting into the soul. But in India, that fear was tempered by a continued respect for Sushruta's legacy. Though many ancient Indian surgical texts were lost or fragmented, their influence echoed into later centuries. In the South, Ayurvedic practitioners performed surgeries for cataracts using fine needles and continued to use honey, ghee, and turmeric as antiseptics. One account from the 18th century, documented by British physicians in Pune, describes a local practitioner performing rhinoplasty using the Sushruta method. Skin from the forehead, turned and grafted onto the nose, stitched carefully, and shaped with fine wooden splints. The British, astounded, recorded the procedure and sent diagrams back to London. It would influence European plastic surgery for decades. Indeed, in Europe, the winds were beginning to shift. The Renaissance, the rebirth of curiosity and questioning, reopened old doors. Surgeons and scholars began to dissect cadavers, not just animals, unlocking the true architecture of the human body. Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist of the 16th century, shattered Galen's errors. In his seminal work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, he detailed human anatomy with unmatched precision. His illustrations revealed muscle layers, organ shapes, bone structures, all drawn from human dissection. Though Vesalius was not a practicing surgeon, his work paved the way for surgical accuracy. No longer would men guess at what lay beneath the skin. The 16th century also saw a rise to battlefield surgery once again. Ambroise, a French barber surgeon, redefined trauma surgery. In a time when bullets replaced arrows and cannon wounds replaced spear gashes, experimented. He found that cauterizing wounds with boiling oil was cruel and unnecessary. Instead, he used clean dressings of turpentine, rose oil, and egg yolk, and found that patients healed faster, screamed less, and lived longer. Promoted ligatures to tie off arteries during amputation rather than searing them with fire. His work saved lives on the field and dignity in the hospital. By the 17th century, surgery was shedding its blood-stained robe of superstition. In London, Paris, and Bologna, hospitals expanded. Universities began to teach surgery as part of medicine, not beneath it. Surgeons now carried watches and forceps, not razors and rumors. Yet still, they had no anesthesia, no antiseptics, no true understanding of infection. Operations were brutal, quick, and soaked in risk. A skilled surgeon could amputate a leg in under 3 minutes. A slower one might lose both the leg and the patient. In this age, pain was not avoided, it was endured. Surgery moved forward, but every step forward left footprints in blood. In 18th century Japan, during the Edo period, surgery became a hybrid of tradition and innovation. Rangaku, Dutch learning, brought Western medical texts into Japanese hands. Some Japanese physicians practiced surgeries using techniques translated from Latin and Dutch. The first Japanese caesarean section recorded where both mother and child survived was in 1799. The surgeon, Hanayoka Seisher, used a herbal anesthetic called sensen, a blend of angelica, belladonna, and other roots. It sedated the patient into unconsciousness, one of the earliest known uses of general anesthesia anywhere in the world. Meanwhile, in pre-colonial Africa, surgery remained rooted in both experience and necessity. Tribes across East and West Africa performed limb amputations, tooth extractions, trepanation, and even complex suturing. In some regions, herbal poultices, heat sterilization, and banana wine were used to reduce infection. Knowledge was passed orally, generation to generation, not in books, but in scars and stories. And then came the 19th century, the century of transformation. Ether, discovered in 1846, changed everything. For the first time in human history, pain could be silenced. Patients could sleep through surgery. Soon after came antisepsis, thanks to Joseph Lister and Louis Pasteur. Lister introduced carbolic acid to sterilize instruments and wounds, dramatically reducing infection and death. Surgeons began washing hands, wearing clean coats, using sterile tools. By the end of the 1800s, the ancient gamble of surgery had changed. Now it was science, not luck. But let us not forget where it began. With obsidian knives on Nile banks, with bronze hooks in Babylon, with whispered prayers over poppy-steeped wounds, with broken bones set beneath banyan trees. Surgery was never born in an operating theater. It was born in huts, temples, battlefields, and burial grounds. It survived because it had to, and every stitch made in silk today is woven from the thread first spun by nameless healers, those who dared to cut, to bleed, and to hope. In the jagged, forested highlands that sprawl from the Adriatic coast into the rugged heart of the Balkans, there once lived a fierce and enigmatic people known to the ancient world as the Illyrians. Warriors, seafarers, and highland dwellers, the Illyrians were as proud of their ancestry as they were of their customs, and nowhere was this more evident than in their bodies. Inked, scarred, and adorned with symbols that told stories deeper than speech. Long before the Romans extended their imperial grasp over the Illyrian territories, these tribes had cultivated an extensive and evolving visual language, a tapestry of body art and sacred symbols that bound them to the earth, the gods, their ancestors, and each other. These were not decorative embellishments alone. Each line inked on skin, each emblem etched into bronze or carved into stone, echoed the legacy of generations and whispered the myths of the bloodline. To understand Illyrian body art, one must begin with the warriors. Illyrian males, particularly those trained for battle, bore intricate tattoos on their arms, chest, and sometimes their faces. These were not merely badges of intimidation. Each mark represented a rite of passage, the successful hunting of a boar, the defense of a village, or the survival of a raid deep into rival territory. Pliny the Elder noted in his Naturalis Historia that certain northern Illyrian tribes bore symbols dyed into the skin, blue and black, resembling animals of legend and creatures of the forests. The inks, likely derived from charcoal mixed with iron oxide and herbal tinctures, were inserted using sharpened bone or copper needles. Pain was embraced, was considered a gift from the gods, a necessary sacrifice to mark one's worth. Common motifs included serpents and coiled dragons, representing rebirth, cunning, and power. Spirals were linked to the journey of life and death, a motif found across burial urns and skin alike. Antlered stags, sacred to the mountain tribes, represented pride, resistance, and spiritual guardianship. The tattoos varied by tribe. Among the Talenti, intricate geometric patterns dominated. Sharp triangles interwoven with line clusters that mimicked the mountain ridge. Meanwhile, the Delmate favored animalistic imagery, with eagles and wolves sprawling across backs and arms, often framed by thorn-like bands that spiraled down limbs. Illyrian women, particularly in priestly and matronly roles, also bore tattoos, but their symbols held different meanings, often connected with fertility, protection during childbirth, and spiritual insight. A high priestess might have a line of crescent moons inked down her spine, or symbolic knotwork at the base of her neck said to ward off evil spirits and bind her to the Moon Mother, one of the key deities in the local pantheon. The most sacred tattoos were reserved for women of the Dorson Hill settlements, known for their skilled artisans and temple keepers. They marked their bodies with mirrored patterns on both arms, representing balance between the mortal and divine, between the land and the sea. These tattoos were considered a visual prayer, a permanent offering to the gods of the mountains and rivers. The process of tattooing was sacred. It was not done casually or for aesthetics. There were festivals, especially during the winter solstice, when children reaching a certain age, so for boys and 13 for girls, would undergo their first tattooing. Around bonfires, elders would sing the ancestral chants, while the skin was marked with traditional symbols that signified growth, protection, and readiness to accept responsibility in the tribe. The Illyrians believed that the body was a vessel, and that marking it with the correct symbols would guide the soul safely through life's chaos. These rites were preserved orally. There were no books or scrolls. Instead, knowledge passed from elder to apprentice, father to son, mother to daughter. Every family had its own slight variation of the patterns, but the base forms, coiling dragons, eagle talons, knotwork bands, solar circles, remained consistent across generations. Some Illyrians also practiced ritual scarification alongside tattooing. Warriors from the Auteriote would mark their victories in battle, not only by ink, but by cutting their skin in elaborate cross-hatchings, letting it heal into raised patterns. These raised scars would form maps of survival and conquest across the chest and forearms. The more battles one survived, the more raised lines one carried. These marks were so important that in certain cases, warriors who died without them would be symbolically scarified posthumously before burial. Symbols were not only limited to skin. Illyrians adorned their weapons, pottery, and jewelry with similar motifs. Shields carried coiled serpents, believed to protect the bearer in battle. Swords had hilts shaped like wolves or boars. Burial urns were decorated with spiral lines and starburst patterns, representing the journey to the other world. Jewelry worn by both men and women included pendants in the shape of solar discs, triangular plaques etched with zigzag lines, and twisted metal bracelets, carrying motifs of the sacred horse, a symbol of speed, nobility, and connection to the spirit world. A particular amulet, found in what is now northern Albania, shows a human figure with outstretched arms, surrounded by 12 lines. It is believed to be an early solar deity, possibly linked to seasonal cycles. Such symbols were often replicated in tattoos, especially by chieftains or spiritual leaders. The religious aspect of Illyrian body art cannot be overstated. The Illyrians worshipped a pantheon of gods closely tied to nature. Every mountain, river, and forest had its guardian spirit. Many symbols in their art were drawn from these beliefs. A man living near the Black Dream River might tattoo his body with fish bones and wave patterns to pay homage to the river spirit. Shepherds in the mountains bore ram horn motifs on their shoulders, evoking protection from wild predators and the favor of the mountain god Bindis. Symbolic masks were sometimes worn during festivals and battles, painted with the same designs found in body art. These masks, often made from bark, cloth, or bronze, were inscribed with protective runes or clan signs. In times of war, warriors would paint their faces with temporary dyes that mimicked the tattoos they bore, enhancing their terrifying appearance. A fierce face marked with the double-headed wolf or the sun serpent was as much a weapon as the blade it accompanied. The deeper one delves into the body art of the Illyrians, the more layered the meanings become. One such symbol was the blood sun, a red circle surrounded by 4 sharp lines, symbolizing the eternal fight between death and life. This was often tattooed over the heart and believed to give courage in battle. It was customary for a dying warrior to clutch the symbol inked on his own chest as his soul crossed into the next world. Another common motif was the tree of breath, a vertical symbol with branching lines to either side. This represented the world tree, connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. Women, especially those involved in herbal medicine, frequently bore this tattoo along their arms or behind the ear. To the Romans, who eventually conquered much of the Illyrian territory, these markings were seen as barbaric or exotic. Yet even Roman chroniclers noted the reverence with which Illyrians treated their body art. Some Roman soldiers reportedly adopted similar tattoos during long campaigns in the Balkans, either out of admiration or to assimilate into local customs. Archaeological findings support much of this. Bronze figurines, burial sites, and remnants of tattoos preserved on mummified skin in mountainous burial chambers all speak to the long-lasting importance of symbolic body marking in Illyrian culture. Even after centuries of cultural erosion, these patterns survived. In remote villages, folk tattoos continued well into the medieval period. Elderly women bore inked crosses and spirals, sometimes mistaken for Christian iconography, though they clearly traced back to older traditions. Songs and lullabies whispered of the serpent mother and the warriors' starachos of an ancient language that refused to die. A hidden connection also exists between Illyrian body art and celestial observation. Some scholars propose that certain tattoos followed the patterns of star constellations visible during solstices and equinoxes. This would make the human body not just a canvas of myths, but also a map of the heavens. Tattoos located on the shoulder blades often resembled the Orion constellation, known in local myth as the hunter beyond the clouds. The use of color in tattoos was limited but meaningful. Black ink was the most common, symbolizing death, strength, and the earth. Red was rare, derived from hematite or crushed berries, and reserved for holy figures or extreme rites. A priestess with red spiral tattoos on her hands was believed to wield power over life and death. Occasionally, blue ink made from indigo or woad was used to represent water and healing. In times of plague or hardship, blue tattoos were added to older patterns in hopes of drawing favor from water deities. Tattoo removal or alteration was considered taboo. To erase a tattoo was to erase one's story, one's past, but modification was allowed. After major life events, a marriage, a victory, a child's birth, new lines would be added, forming layers of identity. The body became a living chronicle, a sacred manuscript etched in flesh. In later centuries, as Christianity spread and Roman culture took hold, the practice of tattooing declined in urbanized areas. Yet, in remote valleys and highland pastures, the old ways endured. Even by the 10th century CE, travelers reported shepherds bearing inked spirals on their calves and old women with suns and stars across their backs. These were not merely leftovers of a forgotten age, but proud continuations of an unbroken chain. Today, in modern Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Bosnia, echoes of Illyrian symbols can still be found in traditional embroidery, in the carved lintels of rural homes, and in folk rituals. But the full story lies beneath the surface, in the skin of those ancient warriors and priestesses who once stood under the same sky, marked with the same lines, carrying the legacy of their people on their very bodies. Illyrian traditions did not simply vanish with the Roman conquest. In the remote mountain passes and along the untamed rivers of the interior, the body art of the Illyrians continued to evolve, adapting subtly to new influences while fiercely guarding its spiritual and ancestral roots. The arrival of the Romans brought new religions, new gods, and new systems of governance, but the Illyrian spirit, etched into flesh and bone, remained defiantly intact in places where the empire's grasp could not reach. Within the enclaves, untouched by the legions, clans passed down the inked heritage generation after generation. By now, body art was not merely cultural, it was sacred inheritance. Children born into warrior families would often be presented before the clan's tattoo priest or priestess by their third winter. It was believed that even the gods could forget a soul if it lacked a symbol. And to die unmarked was to wander the mistlands, an Illyrian version of purgatory, without memory or voice. These early life tattoos were modest, a protective, not near the wrist, a sunray pattern on the shoulder, or a small sigil on the chest drawn in charcoal paste, sometimes allowed to fade before wrinkling during adolescence. The first tattoos were also educational tools, literal lessons in skin. A triangle might represent the sacred unity of land, sea, and sky. A wave-shaped line would remind the child of the river spirit as favor and the importance of honoring natural flows. As the child aged, these tattoos were built upon like bricks in a temple until the full story of their lineage, trials, and duties was inscribed across their skin. In the deeper forested regions of what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina, secret tattoo cults formed. Clans whose knowledge of the sacred symbols became so extensive and arcane that even neighboring Illyrians considered them chosen by the gods. One such cult, the Keepers of the Nine Circles, was known for tattooing circular designs down the spine, each circle said to represent a spiritual gate that the soul must pass through in death. The placement of each circle followed ancient astronomical calculations, some aligning with the phases of the moon, others with the solstice sun. When a member of the cult died, a ritual would be performed in which the circles were painted again with dye, this time on the corpse, to ensure the spirit's clarity on its passage to the beyond. Elsewhere, in the maritime regions along the Adriatic, sailors bore different marks. Life on the sea required different protections. Tattoos shaped like anchors were common, but not in the modern sense. Illyrian anchors were stylized spirals and hooks, symbols meant to tether the soul to the body during violent storms. Sea serpents, believed to lurk beneath the Adriatic waves, appeared often, curling around arms or wrapping from shoulder to rib. Sailors also bore the eye symbol, dot encircled twice, representing both foresight and divine protection. To wear it over the heart was to carry the blessing of Tana, goddess of fate and the sea winds. Interestingly, these maritime tattoos began influencing land dwellers as well, especially in regions where trade routes connected highlands with harbors. Highland warriors might bear a stylized wave under a mountain symbol unifying the two realms and honoring their participation in both. Cultural exchange, though subtle, was inscribed in skin. Women remained vital bearers of symbolic art in matriarchal villages of the southern tribes, especially among the Liburnian Selder women tattooed themselves with lunar cycles and vine motifs across their bellies and thighs. This placement was not aesthetic alone. It symbolized the link between womanhood, fertility, and seasonal agriculture. Each curve of the vine or crescent told a personal story: how many children were born, how many lost, how many survived the famine years. These symbols also doubled as magical inscriptions. It was believed that touching the correct tattoo and whispering ancestral names during childbirth could ease pain or invite divine intervention. Body art had also become a medium for coded communication. In times of intertribal tension, messengers might carry hidden symbols tattooed beneath their clothing emblems that only those trained in their meanings could interpret. A zigzag on the inner wrist might signify betrayal from the east. A spiral with a broken tail could indicate a truce was being offered. Tattooed messengers were revered and feared alike. Their skin could be read like letters, and killing one was said to curse an entire village with misfortune. The symbolic lexicon continued to grow. New patterns emerged, adapted from visions seen during sacred mushroom rites or dream states induced by herbal vapors. The shamans and seers of the inner mountains often returned from their trances with drawings, which they would tattoo on their own legs or ribs as living proof of divine communication. These were called shadowglyphs, and unlike the standard family tattoos, they were abstract, wild, and often asymmetrical. Many were never replicated, as they were believed to be uniquely gifted to each dreamer by the spirits. Possessing a shadow glyph was both a privilege and a burden. It marked one as touched, as someone who walked between the worlds. One legendary figure, Varetha of the Wind, was said to have covered nearly her entire body with shadow glyphs by the time of her death. Villagers claimed her tattoos moved slightly when she breathed, and that during storms her skin shimmered faintly as if calling the thunder. After her death, her skin was carefully flayed and preserved ritually, not for cruelty, but for knowledge. Her tattooed skin became a sacred scroll, consulted by seers for centuries afterward during important rituals. This practice, rare and controversial even among the Illyrians, speaks to how deeply they revered the skin as a tablet of wisdom. During long winters, when the forests were snowed in and wolves prowled closer to homes, families would gather around fire pits and trace the stories on each other's skin. Children would sit silently, eyes wide, as their grandmother rolled up her sleeves and told the tale of each swirl and line across her arms. How the topmost knot marked the year of the great flood, how the spiral near her elbow was inked after her firstborn survived the plague. These were not simply stories, they were survival encoded in flesh. In this way, the body became both history and prophecy, reminder and ritual. With time, Illyrian body art expanded to include sacrificial small incisions that were filled with ash or red pigment during solstice rites. These marks weren't elaborate, but they were deeply symbolic. A line drawn vertically beneath the left eye signified mourning for a warrior who died in battle. A starburst at the base of the neck might mark a woman who offered blood to the river deity during a drought. Such sacrificial tattoos were often performed with sharp bone awls, and the blood mixed directly with the pigment, believed to strengthen the symbol's power. Even the act of tattooing was ceremonial. The tools were not ordinary. Tattooing needles were carved with family motifs. The inkstones used to grind pigments were considered heirlooms. A tattoo could not be administered without reciting the ancestral chant associated with the design. Breaking these rules was unthinkable. It was not just disrespect, it was spiritual sabotage. And if a tattoo was done incorrectly, the tribe would hold a cleansing ceremony to remove its curse, often involving water, smoke, and fasting. Some tribes developed sacred tattoos, only worn in death. Before burial, elders would ink the final marcophone, a bird in flight, or a rising sun upon the forehead or palm of the deceased. This was called the farewell glyph, and it ensured the soul could be recognized by ancestors in the afterlife. Burials without a farewell glyph were rare and always viewed with suspicion. Symbolism even dictated placement. The left arm was associated with one's bloodline. Symbols placed here honored the family. The right arm was the domain of action used to mark deeds, vows, or battles. The back was a canvas for long journeys or large spiritual truths. The stomach and chest, being closest to vital organs, were reserved for the most sacred emblems, symbols of fertility, courage, and divine blessing. In the centuries that followed, as Christianity spread and Illyrian identity was absorbed into new cultures, many of the ancient symbols were hidden or reinterpreted, but the ink never truly faded. In the 14th century, Franciscan monks recorded strange tattoos on Highland shepherds who claimed they were for God's protection. But the motifs, coiled serpents, trees of breath, sun eyes, were unmistakably ancient. Even today, in certain Balkan regions, folk tattoos persist. Women bear dot patterns and crosses that trace back beyond memory. Old songs speak of the ink that binds the wind, and elders still whisper stories of ancestors who bore tattoos that glowed in moonlight. What the Illyrians left behind was not merely art, it was language, legacy, and life. Their bodies were living manuscripts, their skin the parchment of their gods, their scars and ink the poetry of survival. Their symbols endured famine, fire, empire, and time. Though we may never know the full depth of every spiral, every star, every sacred glyph etched into their flesh, we stand in the echo of their Inca quiet, powerful legacy that still speaks beneath the skin of the mountains.